But surprisingly, and I still can't understand how this is happening, while they negotiate and think a lot before they anonymize, we've never heard about organization actually testing and checking whether their anonymous data really is as anonymous as they believe. And this is, of course, a huge reputational and regulatory risk.
Sure. And I want to go deeper on that, on some of the regulatory issues and deeper into synthetic data as well. But let's let Dr. Fu weigh in on this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to approach it from the ad tech perspective. And, from the very early days of digital advertising, the theory was that you could have a lot of data collected on individuals and their behaviors, meaning what they search for online, what websites they visit. And the idea was that you could use that for better targeting or improving targeting. So while that is accurate in theory, in practice, there's a lot of bad data out there as well. So one of the key things I was thinking about in preparation for this webinar is the difference between the bad data that's actually out there and being paid for by advertisers for advertising targeting and the data that's actually being collected on humans. Okay, so let me start with the data that's collected on humans. The ad tech companies have JavaScript on websites. So for example, when a human visitor visits New York Times can set a cookie that pertains to their domain. And that is typically used for sessions. So for example, if you're logged into New York Times, they know that you're logged in. Okay, so New York Times will use their own cookie. That's a first party cookie. But there's also a lot of other ad tech companies from DoubleClick on down. So there could be hundreds of ad tech companies that have JavaScript code also on the page. And those companies set their cookies in the user's browser. Those are called third-party cookies because it's not the site that the human user is visiting. So when you have hundreds of ad tech companies setting hundreds, if not thousands of third-party cookies in your browser, that becomes a problem. Okay, so what's happening is that when the user then goes to another site that has DoubleClick installed on it as well, DoubleClick can read their own cookies and say, okay, this user visited New York Times and these other sites. Okay, so you can start to see where they're starting to gather a website visitation pattern or website visitation history on every user. And if you think about human users, their behaviors are relatively repetitive, right? People have habits and they tend to stick to them. And so, for example, in the morning, I check a few websites for news, stock quotes, and things like that. I also go to Twitter and Facebook and things like that. So the human's behavior is relatively typical, right? There will be changes over time, but typically, it's very similar day to day. So when you have those website visitation patterns, even without an email address, a name, a phone number, right? Those are typically the things that are considered PII, personally identifiable information. An ad tech company can still identify you because they know your patterns. Okay, now you kind of can extrapolate that to millions upon millions of users. And on top of that, for companies like Google and Facebook, the humans are also logged into their services. So they basically self-identified. But I think, we'll stick with the topic of this podcast, which is the de-identified data. I'll tell you, in the ad tech community, when they say de-identified, that basically means they deleted the email address. That basically means they don't have phone numbers or street addresses, postal mailing addresses for the individuals. That's pretty much all they mean. And in the past, that's been satisfactory, right? So prior to all these privacy regulations coming into effect and actually being enforced right now, most of the ad tech companies got away with that, right? That was sufficient to say, oh yeah, we don't have PII, therefore we're privacy compliant. Right. I think the more strict interpretations of the regulations now will say that that's not good enough. But that being said, that's been the practice in ad tech. Okay, so on the one hand, we have collected all these bits of information about the users. And then, Jeff, I'll point out the location stuff. So if you think about a human user, I typically have a certain way to walk to work, right? And other people in California, they might have a certain way they drive to work. And they typically drive the same route every single day. They might even stop at the same Starbucks every single morning, right? So again, with a few location data points, you can pretty much identify that individual, right? And then furthermore, they go between their home and their office. And now with mobile identifiers, so a lot of these rogue mobile apps can collect your Apple ID or your Google Android ID. And they know that this device ID went home to this IP address, and that same device ID went to this office, right? And they do that repeatedly every single weekday. So again, even with 2 data points like that, they can pretty much identify that same individual uniquely, okay? So that's the problem. And like Alexandra was saying before, if we had small data sets that were kind of isolated from each other, the de-identification methods in the past were probably sufficient. But now that every data set is pretty much interoperable and it's pretty much bought and sold because all these ad tech companies sell the data to make money. So you start to lose control. And then when you have a big data kind of approach to it and you have large pools of data that are now kind of being dumped together, that's what makes it so easy to re-identify the information, even though the individual data sets don't have an email address, a phone number, or their person's name. So I think a lot of that kind of stuff is just, we're only scratching the surface in terms of starting to enforce the actual privacy regulations. And most of this stuff, the humans don't actually understand. When I'm visiting New York Times, 120 other ad tech companies are harvesting my data. And then all of those companies are selling my data without my knowledge and without my consent. And most humans have no control over that, right? Because the data is in the ether, right? They don't know who has it and who sold it. So I'll pause there and see if that makes sense so far.
Yeah, I think in the future, Jeff, what we always should do is bring someone in who's totally oblivious to that topic, right? Because right now we're doing a lot of self-selecting. I see like people nodding because yes, we all feel like that. We all know that, right? Point there being though is I think at some point in time we basically need to do an exercise where we pick on someone, i.e., we'll pick an executive of a large technology company and just apply those technologies to him and make an episode where it's kind of a docudrama. Hey, let me tell you what you did the last 24 hours and let me then tell me how you felt about that. As in that we created that for you. And maybe we'll introduce some psyops ideas. So it's like, let's see if we can get him to buy some ice cream.
Well, Chris, there was a question I just answered in the chat about what's the best book that I can read on sort of privacy issues like this. And one of the answers that I gave was Privacy is Power, which is by Carissa Valise. And she actually has, I think it's the first or second chapter of that book, is it walks through a day in the life of someone in our sort of surveillance capitalism world and talks about every single one of those sort of potential interactions we can have with devices and services hoovering up all of our digital dust. And it's scary. I mean, we sort of think about, all these sort of one-off instances, but it's everywhere. And frankly, to sort of, Dr. Fu enumerated a lot of the sort of ad tech issues, but it even really goes further than that. If you think about all the real-time bidding stuff that goes on with our ad tech data, there are companies that are bidding for our data that are not actually even interested in giving us an ad. They're just in the ad ecosystem to collect whatever data they can get in that ad bid system so that they can build profiles on us.
Yeah, and the one thing that I always try to alert people to, because we're talking about surveillance capitalism a lot, but to me,
I think we've lost Chris.
Let's hope. No, I thought my machine was freezing up.
Yeah, usually, but looks like he's reconnecting.
Okay.
Maybe
yes.
he was too critical about data collection practices and somebody interfered here.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Okay, am I back?
Yes, we got you.
Oh, thank you, guys. Yeah, I don't know what happened. I was trying to make something better, made it worse, I think. No, my input was simply the fact that yes, there's this whole problem of people living under some form of surveillance capitalism, but there's a larger problem of people that are living under authoritarian governments. And these tools obviously can be used to turn people on to buy certain products or services, but the much more nefarious use cases that of using it against your own citizens and for such crimes as disagreeing with the government's opinion and then disappear those folks because it's just so easy to identify them. Anyway, so that's always something I like to add, because that's, to me, the larger problem here ultimately. Because
I'm not sure if I would fully agree. I mean, of course, what you pointed out is the worst scenario compared to just getting delivered more ads that nudge you into buying stuff. But I think even in democracies and areas where we don't have authoritarian states, I find it highly concerning what we currently see going on in the data ecosystem, because we have these monopolies of data owners, and we've seen in the past with Cambridge Analytica and certain other activities happening that those activities don't only bring the commercial benefits and the monopoly on innovating and getting to a size where it's hard for the free market to do what it's supposed to do, but actually also interfering with democracy, freedom of speech, and so many other areas of lives. And I work a lot with regulators. I'm also advising the European Parliament. And what concerns me is that this is something that's not necessarily on the radar of an average politician or regulator, because they don't necessarily understand how widespreading data and artificial intelligence are and how interwoven they are with so many important aspects of society. So I'm concerned about surveillance in authoritarian states, but definitely also with what's happening in the European Union, in the UK, and in the United States.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I was just rewatching like this docudrama around Cambridge Analytica, and most people probably already forgot, unfortunately, that they were testing these weapons, and actually Brittany Kaiser calls them weapons, right? So they're PSYOPs weapons of sorts. They were testing those on some African nations. They were involved in the Brexit operation. And so these outcomes are directly attributable. Is that a word? Let's assume it's a word. Can be directly attributed to the deployment of these weapons, right? Because people don't have a defense mechanism against that. They don't know that they are being manipulated, right? And to me, this is simply criminal. As far as I'm concerned, this is just criminal behavior.
Yeah, let me chime in and add some color to that. So a lot of people think that the Cambridge Analytica scandal with the 2016 elections here in the US involved political ads. So a lot of the Facebook response was in creating the Facebook Ad Transparency Center, so you could see all the ads. And they also started requiring any political advertiser to declare the ad was political. Okay, so that was fine. But of course, the bad guys are not going to declare their ad as political. Okay, so first of all. And then the second thing is it's what Chris calls PSYOPs, right? Psychological operations. So what happened in 2016 is that because Cambridge Analytica analyzed the profiles of many, many Facebook users, simply because they scraped all that data and understood who was susceptible. I'll give you the example. I don't know if you've seen there's the personality quizzes, those things on Facebook. It was prolific in the years leading up to 2016. Basically, the humans who took those quizzes, and also the ones who participated in the quizzes that said, which celebrity do I look like, right? So in those cases, they know that those people are susceptible, right? They're easier to manipulate. And so the way they did the 2016 manipulation was that they posted false news in the organic news feed in Facebook. It wasn't ads. It was simply articles from sites like abcnew.com. So 2016, there was a site called ABC New without the S, and it plagiarized the logo of ABC News. So most people, if they don't look closely, they won't realize that there was no S there. So abcnew.com was a fake site. They wrote articles as if it were news, and then they cross-posted that to Facebook. And then they used the fake accounts or the bot accounts to like and share those news items so that they got amplified. So then most of the people who followed certain accounts got to see those news. those news items in their organic feed, not as ads. So over time, they actually thought that was real. And so that's how the psychological manipulation took place. And in particular for the US elections, there were only 5 states that Trump needed to win in order to win the whole thing. So they concentrated their efforts in those 5 states. I think Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and a few other states were the key ones. And they basically got a small number of additional individuals to go out and vote for Trump. I think the number was 75,000 in 5 states, right? It wasn't millions. It didn't take lots and lots of humans. They just needed enough humans in those 5 states to go vote for Trump. And I think the count was a very small number, 75,000. And they voted, and they caused the entire election to be swung in one direction. So that's psychological operations. It's collecting data that people volunteered. So on Facebook, they didn't know that anyone else was listening, right? When they volunteer all their information to Facebook, they thought Facebook had it. But now Facebook is starting to claim that, oh, they didn't know that all these third parties were scraping their data, right? So whether that's true or not, we're not sure. But bottom line is, other third parties got access to tremendous troves of data without the knowledge and consent of the humans who were on Facebook. And the same thing is happening on other social media platforms, Twitter recently, TikTok, and so on and so forth, right? The same exact phenomenon is happening on all of those platforms. And humans, they're still not sufficiently aware of the danger that they're in. And like Alexandra was saying, politicians have, 0.1% knowledge of these issues. So they can't construct accurate regulations to help prevent any of this stuff. So it's really about raising awareness amongst, the advertisers who are paying for this stuff, the consumers, so that they protect themselves using privacy, ad blockers, tracker blockers, and things like that. So it's really in a very dire state right now.
Definitely. And I think what's a pity about this whole situation is, of course, there are some things that you can do, like you just pointed out, but overall, you can't just avoid being tracked, or you would have to, I don't know, move somewhere in the most rural area that you can come up with. I think there was even this, I'm not sure if she was from the New York Times, a journalist who tried this experiment for 1 year, 10 years ago, and concluded, okay, you can't really live like that. So we need to have this regulation in place to protect people from that happening, because we can't push this burden on individuals. But at the same time, I'm just thinking with everything you pointed out about Cambridge Analytica, back to the Netflix documentary, or the documentary that was also available on Netflix on coded bias. I once sat on a panel with the team behind that production, and one of the involved team members pointed out, and it was also pointed out in the documentary, the researchers from Facebook who also published some of the results in the context of Cambridge Analytica showed that with the differences in how they displayed ad, I think if I remember correctly, it was showing somebody the pictures of the friends who already voted to kind of nudge this person to also go vote, really shifted a few thousand of people. And then they also pointed out to, as you just said, usually win an election, it doesn't take millions, you just need to have a certain amount of people, and they were already above that amount in what they were able to shift. So whenever we see a regulator now going strong against big tech and some of the practices that we see in ad tech, how likely is it that they will succeed in the United States with the power that we have here from big companies in influencing individuals' decisions?
I want to say something, though, about the PSYOPs, because a lot of people, I think, don't believe that they can be manipulated. But I want to, maybe have people think about it this way. I mean, if you look at all of the spam that goes out, right? I mean, you might get a billion text messages or emails out there about Viagra, right? I mean, why do those spammers do that? Because 1 in a million people are going to respond to those things, right? So somebody gets manipulated there. Maybe it's an incredibly small percentage, right? But then you think about phishing attempts, right? And those are maybe a little bit more effective, right? So a few people get sucked in by those phishing attempts. And then if you think about business email compromise, that percentage is even a little bit higher than that, right? A few of us fall for these fake business emails, right? And they break into our accounts, right? If you so they get more and more sophisticated. And there's like spear phishing, right? Where executives are getting targeted by these things, right? And they have used a little bit more personal information, a little bit more persuasion, right? And they get executives to actually, give away secrets, and they break into their systems. Imagine if they know all of this information about you and can target you with whatever. In this case, it's advertisements, right? That can sort of subtly persuade you, not even to give away information, but just to change your behavior slightly. Over time, that can be extremely effective. And that's essentially what these people are doing with not only political ads, but ads for purchasing things, or ads for, doing whatever it is they want you to do. And that's why it's so insidious.
Yeah, and Jeff, I'm going to actually add a nuance in there. I actually don't think the digital ads work that well. I actually think the organic stuff works much better. So humans, because of the rise of digital advertising, right? Humans use ad blockers, and humans know to ignore the right-hand side of the page and the top of the page, right? There's been a lot of studies called banner blindness. So humans' eyes basically avoid the top and the right. So in those cases, the ads don't work as well. And that's why I pointed out the detail earlier about the Cambridge Analytica thing. It wasn't political ads that caused those people to vote for Trump. It was the organic stuff that they saw in the news feed over and over again that they thought was real. So then, like Alexander said, they even showed their friends voted. So go out and vote, right? So, those are the kinds of things that humans now instinctively know to distrust ads. So I'm going to just put the nuance in here, that the ads don't actually work that well. And a lot of big advertisers are wasting billions of dollars buying those ads. They would do much better to be more like Cambridge Analytica and understand their customers better and create content that's actually useful for them, right? As opposed to ads, which are stuck in a 300 by 250 that people ignore anyway. So you see the difference between the ads versus, there's a whole, the ad tech industrial complex wants the advertisers to believe that the ads work because they get paid to run those ads for them. But I actually don't think the digital ads work that well. There's a lot of other more effective stuff to do the marketing, right? To spend their money on instead of just, tens of billions of ads per week.
Yeah. And what they're selling hasn't been ads per se, right? They're really selling social engineering as a service. That's what they sold to the Trump campaign, right? So they taught them how to use these tools for massive social engineering campaigns. Right. So as you
I think, Chris, you're talking about in this vertical. I'm talking more generally, all the advertising that's being done in digital. So in the US, it's 190 billion spent in digital. And globally, we're about to surpass 500 billion spent in digital every year. So that's more general, like trying to sell soup and soda using digital ads. So as opposed to, the Cambridge Analytica stuff, which was, yes, like you said, it's PsyOps and social engineering.
Right. So the question is, have any actual advertisers for products and services that people end up buying, use the same tactics?
Yeah.
Or not?
Not that I'm aware. And in fact, it's so bad that, P&G turned off 200 million in digital spending and saw no change in business outcomes. And Chase reduced 99% of their programmatic reach, meaning they reduced the number of websites showing their ads from 400,000 sites to 5,000 sites, and they saw no change in business outcomes. So I would implore the advertisers who are not on this call, but I would implore them to turn off their digital ads for a week and see what happens. Nothing's going to happen because
I think we're going to cut out this particular call to action as its own snippet and put it back on social media with your permission.
Yeah.
But, to get to sort of bring this back to re-identification, right? None of that can really happen if these people weren't actually being able to re-identify that information, right, and tie it back to an individual. It doesn't have to be, they don't have to actually tie it back to Augustine Fu, right? But they have to tie it back to a profile, right, that has a lot of information to it, right? Probably much more information than they're actually getting from that one particular ad placement, from that ad server, right?
Yeah, so I think the way in ad tech, the way it works is they're just essentially targeting an anonymous cookie. So they see this cookie, this cookie has visited these websites. So they basically infer various characteristics about them and they create audience segments with that cookie in it. And then the advertisers are essentially buying that. They don't have to have identifying information. So yes, we're talking about the topic of re-identification. Yes, that's very eminently possible. But in ad tech, most of the ads are not targeted to individuals. They're just targeted to anonymous cookies.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's go a little bit different direction. Let's talk a little bit about synthetic data. What can you tell us about that, Alexandra? I think it's a good solution, but I've heard people complaining a little bit about maybe synthetic data is not a perfect solution either. I happen to like it. I think it has a lot of promise, and it's probably going to get more and more popular. What can you tell us about your solution?
Sure, happy to give you an overview. So I think the first thing for the audience to understand is that there's no clear definition of synthetic data. The term actually was also coined roughly a decade ago. But what the hype is about is actually the subcategory of AI-generated synthetic data. And still there are two main subgroups in there which are interesting. The one is the space where we not work in, which is more in the space of, okay, data scarcity, and you simply don't have the data that you need to, for example, train an AI. Think of autonomous vehicles. If you want to make sure that this autonomous vehicle always jumps into the brakes, if there's, I don't know, a child, a rabbit, whoever running on the street, you need to have plenty of training examples to train the algorithms to do that. But of course, you only have a limited number of, let's say, videos of rabbits running on the street at different times of the day, different lighting condition, and so on and so forth. So if you were to task a video crew, please deliver me 360 different degrees of rabbits running on a street, whether there's, I don't know, lightning, snow, clouds, night, and so on and so forth in the background, potentially it will be impossible and you will never get your videos back. So there you can use synthetic data to have a few seeding examples of rabbits running on the street, plus your knowledge of physics, how lighting conditions shift, how rain changes some visual aspects, and so on and so forth, to generate more examples. But when we talk about privacy, the more interesting category is actually AI-generated synthetic data for the purpose of anonymization. So there you have the possibility to let a deep learning algorithm look at an original data set. As I mentioned, we work a lot with highly regulated industries. So let's, for this example, take a bank. So the algorithm would look at the financial transactions of a bank, and automatically the algorithm is capable of picking up all the highly granular patterns, correlations, the overall data structure, and so on and so forth. And based on this knowledge, the algorithm creates new synthetic financial customers with their financial transactions. And if you look on these data sets from a statistical point of view, you wouldn't really be able to distinguish them. You would get the same results, so same percentage of males and females, but also when you zoom in, I don't know, the same percentage of 42 to 45-year-old males who earn that much amount of money and love to go to Hawaii and buy travel books or something like that. You would still have the same percentages, but in contrast to traditional anonymization techniques, since you only learn from the original data, but don't take any direct data points into the synthetic data, you don't have an attack surface to re-identify if you generate it with the necessary privacy mechanisms. And this basically solves the two pitfalls of traditional anonymization techniques, which are that they are destructive in nature. So they always rely on the original data set and try to delete as many data points as necessary to make sure, or try to make sure, that this data is anonymous, which of course deletes lots and lots of information. To quote another example here based or similar in the direction from what you shared earlier at the beginning of the call, if you think of your financial transactions, everybody of us will have a few dozens, a few hundreds of credit card transactions per year. Only 3 out of these hundreds of transactions per individual are sufficient. Not even everything that you have about this transaction, but just the merchant and just the date. So yesterday Starbucks, last week Walmart. just these bits of information from 3 transactions are sufficient to re-identify over 80% of individuals. So if you see how much information banks have and how much they can retain before they run into this really high re-identification risk, you see what I mean with this destructive approach. So if you want to do AI training on that data, traditional anonymization is definitely not your friend. And the second pitfall is, of course, the high re-identification and privacy risk that comes with that. And this is something that you can avoid when using synthetic data, because you preserve the data utility, but also from a privacy point of view, you create data that doesn't have any one-to-one relations to real individuals in there, which allows you to use this data for every statistical analysis, AI training, and so on and so forth, but not tying back information to single individuals.
It seems really pretty great for a lot of different use cases. When I was developing software, I had a lot of use cases where we needed test data, and synthetic data seems like an obvious use case for that, right?
It's actually one of the top 3 use cases for it. So number 1, by far, AI training. Then we have external data sharing, particularly in a post-RAMS 2 era. This got more complicated, and collaboration with startups, AI vendors, moving to the cloud is something that's on the agenda of every organization that is keen to digitally transform themselves. And then, of course, software testing, where you also need realistic data. But sorry for interrupting you.
Well, no, does it have problems with things like being able to do forecasting?
There are not really that many applications yet where synthetic data is used in production for forecasting. There are expectations that it will be highly valuable for that, but current state of the art is not really using it for forecasting. But what it is highly promising is when we go away from the privacy domain and into the domain of responsible AI. When working with regulators, I also focus a lot on responsible AI and how to write regulations that ensure algorithms don't discriminate, are explainable, and so on and so forth. And if we look at the whole ecosystem of artificial intelligence, we all know that there is this AI talent shortage. But the responsible AI talent shortage is even greater. So if you look 5 years into the future, where every nation around the world wants to have more participants in the AI ecosystem and more people developing or building algorithms or AI-powered systems, we will have even more people who don't have this knowledge. And therefore, in the UK and in the European Union and some other parts of the world, we see this AI assurance ecosystems emerging, where it's about building up tools and services, having bias auditors, explainable AI as a service, and so on and so forth, to help organizations really make sure that their AI is ethical and responsible. And here synthetic data also comes into play, because if you want to put a stamp on an algorithm to tell, hey, this doesn't discriminate against Black people, for example, you can't do that just by assessing the code. You need to have realistic examples. And with synthetic data, the beauty is you can smartly upsample data, and you can create a data set that not only reflects the world as is, as we do it in the privacy context, but as it should be, with much more examples of minority groups, with the data set where you don't have a male-female gender pay gap, and so on and so forth. In fact, on my podcast, I just had the health insurance Humana, where they talked about using fair synthetic data to make sure that their algorithms actually work equally well for different demographic groups and different genders. So quite some potential here for synthetic data in that space.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
While we were talking here, Amazon just announced that they bought One Medical for $3.9 billion. So now they have a lot more data of everybody on their physical well-being that they can use to sell you better supplements, ostensibly. So that's useful.
Wonderful.
And Alexandra, I had a question for you.
Sure.
When you say synthetic, you don't actually mean fabricated, right? You mean data that's derived from real data sets? Or does synthetic also mean you can just fabricate data out of thin air?
Yes and no. Of thin air, no, you can't. The way we do it, it's more learning from original data, but in a safe way that you don't learn any privacy secrets, but only learn statistical information. With the other category I explained earlier, it goes in the direction of thin air because you can use your knowledge of physics or other domain expertise. But of course, I can't do that in healthcare, for example, and just say, okay, I have a clinical study that was done predominantly on males, and now I just try to, out of thin air, create some synthetic data that I hope is accurate and useful for female bodies or something like that. So with what we do is much more, okay, there is some data in existence, but it's locked away in a silo, or it can only be accessed by a privileged group of very few people. How can we safely allow an organization to open this data resource up and use it internally to build models or test the systems?
I was asking in the context of testing those algorithms. So for example, you want to test whether an algorithm has any kind of bias against Black people built in. So then you would create a synthetic data set that has that built in and see if that algorithm biases against Black people. That's what I meant by, in that case, it's okay to create data out of thin air, right?
There are some ways where you have enough information in there. If you don't have any Black individual in the data set, you can't do it. If you have a small group, but the algorithm can learn from other subgroups and connect that with that group, it's possible. Plus another idea that we had with some regulators, and it's also something that some AI auditors, or soon to be AI auditors, which mainly come from the insurance and reinsurance space, had, was that they just pool data and make sure to build up a kind of gold standard synthetic data set that's hyper diverse, because many organizations just use the customer data that they have on hand, which not perfectly represents the diversity.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the reason I asked that was that in ad tech, I've seen entirely fabricated data sets. So some of the fraud that I've studied, for example, the mobile exchanges that were defrauding Uber to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, they were fabricating the data to make it appear that they ran the ads that got a lot of clicks, that got app installs. None of it actually occurred. They just made it all up.
Yeah. No, definitely there are some areas where you can make stuff up, but with others it's not that wise. So yeah.
Hey, Alexandra, I had a question. I've actually seen, I think it was actually a competitor in the synthetic data space. I saw a demo of one of their things, and sort of a question. So they were generating data, and one of the pieces of data, I don't think it was actually health data, but let's use that for this example. So say this particular value needed to be between like 5 and 20. And so you set sort of parameter for generation of this particular piece of data. But as you're setting the parameters for generating a particular piece of data, aren't you really sort of defining that, and maybe you don't actually know what those parameters should be? So like say if it's like blood pressure is supposed to be between here and here, but you know, how does the, you know, I guess if you're using AI, maybe it makes more sense rather than deterministically setting that particular value. But I mean, what if the value should actually be outside that range based upon if you would actually collect that data? So I guess I'm saying, right?
Not sure if I fully get your question, but I mean, as I mentioned, synthetic data is not a clearly defined term, and particularly in the last 1.5 years, the hype got bigger. We had Gartner predictions like in 2024, 60% of all AI will be synthetic. So currently we see lots of synthetic data tags on products which actually don't really do AI generated synthetic data, but just traditional anonymization or some other statistical techniques. So depending on the use case, but what I know from our healthcare clients, they actually want to get access to the data that they have available. So they let the AI train on this data, learn everything, also the outliers. I mean, not the extreme edge cases and extreme outliers, but edge cases to a certain degree, to have all this representation in there. And this is quite fascinating to give you an example from the financial services industry. Way back in, I think it was 2017, 2018, one of our clients found some patterns, some spending patterns and some income patterns in some synthetic financial customers where they told us, hey, this is nuts. Nobody has 5 income streams and spends the money like that. This can't be true. Please check your software. I'm sure there's a bug in there. And we looked at the software and told them, it looks like everything worked fine. Please try to have a look at the real data. At this point in time, they were never allowed to see the data because the bank has so strict regulations on there so that many teams can't even see production data ever. But they went through the whole chain, got some permissions, and one individual got the permission to look in the data. And in fact, in the real customer base, they had a few people who had this type of spending behavior. So creating synthetic data actually allowed them to better understand their customers and learn about how not only the average John and Jane Doe behave, but also what you have on the outer edges of the curve. I mean, you wouldn't get everything in there from privacy perspective. So usually I tell individuals you can think of synthetic data as giving you 99% of the utility you would have from the real data. In Austria, for example, where I'm located and where I'm currently streaming from, we don't have as many billionaires as in the United States. So if a bank only has 3 billionaires, they wouldn't even be included in the synthetic data training because it could already be telling that they have billionaires as customers or something like that. But as soon as there are like 20 individuals, 30 individuals having some similar patterns in the healthcare space, financial space, you would get that information. And that's pretty good when you want to do AI training.
Yeah. Vikram from the audience posed a very interesting question that I'm going to read to you guys. He says, marketers have a phrase for the manipulation. It's called prime vulnerability moments. My biggest concern is that a lot of discussion focuses on companies like Facebook and Google, but what about Samsung, TCL, Xiaomi, and more? We could make Facebook and Google put up safeguards, and data brokers can always source from these other sources as well. Curious to hear about panelists' thoughts on these alternative sources that can be controlled or governed.
Put simply, I think each of those manufacturers like TCL, they make the TVs, Samsung, Xiaomi, they make the different handsets and now connected TVs. They're each going to have their own data set. But then because of data brokers and because of the ease with which companies can just buy and sell data, they can join those data sets into other data sets and re-identify. So I think the regulation should apply to everyone, even though right now most of the regulators are talking about Facebook and Google, the regulation should still apply to the smaller companies that are doing the exact same thing. So I think the privacy regulation should specify the processes that are allowed and the processes that are not allowed. So for example, if you collect consent from the user, the consent might be that you can collect the data, right? The Samsung TV can collect data on which TV shows you watch, but the Samsung should not be selling that data to someone else without the consent and knowledge of the consumers, right? So I'm not sure that all the regulations are going to be written properly that way. But, it's really not about Facebook or Google. It should be about everyone. And it should be about the processes and how to actually properly protect the data and store the data and things like that.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And the other part to even put this one step further in a way is we should expect that the default is that we are not being surveilled, right, by any device, right? So even like if you think about devices that you don't own and where you just pass, let's say, some surveillance camera, and now it's so trivial at this point in time to get commercial grade software to identify you, right? So should there be some third party that you don't know even exists be able to have this data and then be able to forward this data? So as far as I'm concerned, this is kind of device level information that by default there should be kind of a breaker switch in there that this even can't be the case, because unfortunately we talk about this all the time. By and large, people have conditioned to think of privacy as a checkbox that they check off when they subscribe to a product or service, and that's that, right? So they don't think about it until and if this data is being used to do something that they don't agree with, right? But the problem is that those two instances hardly ever coincide. It's not like that you're immediately experiencing the negative consequences of this information overload. So I had this idea of that your own devices should be able to alert you to this kind of violently, as in, like simple example would be, I have my phone here right in front of me, I'm not using it to the extent that I need to send someone geolocation data. So if it does that, it should just turn on a klaxon saying, hey, your phone is transmitting your geolocation. Why is it doing that? You're not using it.
There's some more nefarious things. Chris, you may or may not know about this. Here in New York City, there's a lot of these free Wi-Fi stations where you can plug your device in for charging and then it gets free Wi-Fi. Basically, those were sponsored by Google at some point. It's called Link NYC, and they were sponsored by Google. So there was like a hotspot at Bryant Park and various public places. So when your device walks by and your Wi-Fi is not turned off, because of Wi-Fi scanning, those towers or those hotspots will actually see your device ID. So there's nothing, you can't prevent that. And even your device won't know that that's happening because it's basically scanning everything. And those hotspots will pick up your scan and then be able to know your location. So the reason that came to a head was, I was looking on Google Maps and I could see my own device. So on Find My Device, I could actually see it was connected to a Link NYC. It was not connected to a Link NYC hotspot, but that was what Google used to locate my device, even though I didn't actually connect to that Wi-Fi hotspot. So there are those kinds of things that are outside of your own device that there's no switch to switch off. And I think most consumers don't actually know that's happening.
Yeah.
Well, we are 2 minutes out, so why don't you lead us out, Jeff? I know we could, as always, talk another hour about these things, but
yeah, this was a good discussion.
Yes, loved it, Augustine, Alexander. So, I mean, thank you so much. We need to have you back on and discuss this some more. And as I said, Augustine, with your permission, we're gonna clip out this one call to action and promote this further.
Sure.
Absolutely. Well, yes. So, folks, this has been a great episode. I want to thank our guests, Alexandra Ebert and Augustine Fu, for your participation in this panel. Hope everybody has a great weekend. Again, this has been Your Bytes, Your Rights, episode 22, and hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
See you next episode.
See you next time.
All right.
So we were able to start the stream 13 minutes and you saw that, right?
Yeah, I did. I saw it when it started.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, now I have to figure out how to fix this. If you saw the mess here. I have like an open computer here and then I have to do a presentation Sunday night and there's information on there that I only have on there. So I'm going to be spending Saturday with that. All right, everybody. Have a good weekend. Talk to you soon.